Well, good morning. It is such a joy to be with you. I bring greetings from Princeton Theological Seminary, where I do have the joy of serving these days. I'm truly delighted to be with you, and thanks to Pastor Bill for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for the warm welcome. I'm grateful for the chance this morning to gather around the biblical text, to recenter ourselves amid the demands of our everyday lives and work, amid the cacophony of the world, amid our never-ending to-do lists. Amid it all, I'm grateful for the chance to pause and journey into this text. After all, full disclosure, travel is one of my favorite things. Being a professor, I have the chance to work remotely in the summers, allowing me the luxury of travel, some for work, some for family, some for fun. Sometimes they overlap. I can have fun with my family. Last summer, I had the opportunity to go to Ireland, Hilton Head, Chicago, and even Iceland. There is so much I enjoy about travel. The experiences, seeing the sights, the food, taking in the culture of the place, the food. But upon reflection, I think I love to travel most because the newness, the new places, the new people, the new cuisine opens me to wonder. It is so easy in our day-to-day lives to go through the motions and miss moments for wonder. Moments to be surprised or delighted, moments to find ourselves in awe or enraptured by something beyond or around us. And while I seem to be able to pause and wonder when I travel, I often miss those opportunities in my everyday life. In fact, a couple of months ago, I was walking my little dog, Toby, through a park up the street from my house. We were doing our regular loop, and I was absorbed with getting the walk done so I could get to the next thing on my to-do list. But along the path, there was an older gentleman who was wandering slowly, stopping, staring at each of the trees. When we approached him, he looked at me and said, "Have you seen this place? It's like an arboretum. There are so many different kinds of trees." And he's actually right. This park has a wide variety of trees with labels on each tree of what it is and where it is native to. "It is beautiful," I responded to the man finally looking around, maybe for the first time that day. And the trees were glorious. "Look at all these people walking through and not even noticing," he chided. And I immediately knew I was one of them. But that's the thing. Sometimes we take familiar sights, sounds, stories even for granted. Unlike when we encounter the newness of travel, we miss opportunities for wonder. We assume we know what we will find, how things will go, or how the story will end. And I think that might be the temptation with our text from Matthew today. This story of the laborers in the vineyard is one of the more well-known parables of Jesus, or at least familiar to those of us who have regularly attended worship or gone to church camp. And most of us may be familiar with the moral of the story: the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. However, I wonder if this familiarity might actually be a problem. I'm afraid that by assuming we know how the story ends or how the story goes, we may miss some of the surprising details that make this parable remarkable and somewhat unsettling. Even more, we may skip past those unexpected features that point us to more deeply understand the nature of God and what it means to be people of faith in these challenging, divisive, and uncertain days. So I want to invite us to take our time this morning to be travelers into this story, to revisit it with a sense of wonder. I want to try to not jump so quickly to the end or to the moral of the story, and maybe we can discover God's Spirit moving along the way. So let's dive in. The story begins in a largely predictable way. There are three primary sets of characters: a landowner, a manager, and people needing work. The first surprise comes when the landowner, not the manager, goes out to the marketplace to hire laborers. And in spite of this very rare appearance by a wealthy landowner, the initial arrangement is typical and in line with Jewish custom. Workers are hired at the start of the day to be paid 1 denarius, a normal daily wage at the end. But in the second surprise, the landowner goes back to the marketplace for those who were contracted to have a chance to get much done. The landowner unexpectedly had more workers every few hours. And keeps doing this to the 5 o'clock hour when there is little daylight or maybe even little work remaining. Those hired at 9 and noon and 3 are not offered a full contract like those hired first thing in the morning, but they are willing to trust the landowner to pay them whatever is right. And those 5 o'clock hires, they weren't promised anything but the opportunity to work. The number of trips to the marketplace to hire additional people in the day is odd enough. However, there is more that is unusual. As a responsible and wealthy businessman, the landowner should have figured out in advance how many workers he would need that day. Yet there is nothing in this parable to indicate that he miscalculated the work-to-workers ratio. This strange landowner hires workers not because there is too much work, but because there are people in need of something to do. The landowner's focus in this parable is not on the harvest or the crop or even his own profit. Instead, he is concerned that the laborers are there and they need work. Now, the last unusual feature of the story arrives with the third scene, when the workers are lined up by the manager to be paid in order of when they were hired. This is perhaps the biggest twist of all. The landowner has the manager begin with the 5 o'clock hires and pays them a full day's wage. Now, if we were to take a photo at this moment, a Polaroid, if you will, I imagine down at one end of the line, the 5 o'clock workers' faces would be marked by disbelief, gratitude, even shock as they looked down at what they had just been paid. And then at the other end, I imagine you might catch smirks and side eyes, faces marked by an eager anticipation as it dawns on them they might get more than what they had agreed to. At this point in the story, both ends of the line view the landowner as wildly generous. But when the manager gets down to those who had been hired first thing in the morning and worked all day, they too receive exactly what they had contracted for, 1 denarius, a day's wage. And all of a sudden, their view of the landowner changes. No longer is he an odd yet generous character, but instead someone who clearly lacked common sense, business savvy, or any appreciation for what is just or right. Yet when these all-day workers grumble against the landowner asserts that it is his money to do with what he wanted, and he paid them fairly, per their agreement. The landowner then asks the cutting question, "Are you envious because I am generous?" Or, perhaps better translated, "Is your eye evil because I am good?" And this question is a challenging one. After all, those who worked all day are not mad because the landowner was generous to the 5 o'clock workers, but because he was not proportionally generous to everyone. The landowner seems to be living in a different world and playing by different rules than the rest of them. Now, while unsettling, it is these odd and unexpected features that cut to the heart of this parable. As Professor Tom Long suggests, this parable is not a lesson in corporate economics or an example of how employers, even Christian ones, are to treat their employees. The purpose of this parable is not to provide a practical guide for the management of a vineyard, a factory, or a classroom. Instead, friends, these odd and unusual details are an invitation to recognize the vast difference between our present reality and the kingdom of God. The parable insists that God does not work around our customs, around our beliefs, around our sense of justice. These peculiar plot twists and bizarre actions of the landowner serve to break our expectations and rupture our sense of what is right and what is practical. Put another way, this parable invites us to holy imagination. Friends, I don't have to tell you that we are living in what feels like chaotic times. Between hurricanes and flooding on the East Coast to deadly, destructive wildfires on the West, from escalating political divisions to the reality of ongoing war and gun violence, from the everyday demands on our time and attention and the uncertainty of our social, economic, and ecological futures, it can be easy to feel overwhelmed, to feel disoriented, to feel unmoored from ourselves and our communities. And in our overwhelm and disorientation, it is sometimes hard to have any kind of imagination for something beyond our present circumstances. In such formidable days, we, even as people of faith, may find our holy imagination limited. In fact, we may fall prey to believing that God's future is our present just a little bit better. That God's future is just a little less violence, or a few more people getting along, or a few more hours in the day or week for rest or work or play. In times like these that are challenging and filled with uncertainty, we have remarkably low expectations for what God can and will do. We lose our capacity for holy imagination. However, this parable invites us towards renewed and reinvigorated imagination. The parable is not suggesting some new economic system or a Christian business model. Instead, the unusual and even confounding details of this parable invite us to glimpse the incomprehensible nature of God's grace and love. This story reminds us that God is not bound by our limited imaginations. On the contrary, God continually invites us to expanded visions and glimpses of the kingdom already coming toward us. I remember the first youth mission trip I ever led when I was pastoring my congregation in Virginia. We took about 15 youth up to Appalachian country in West Virginia. And on the third day of the trip, our group was tasked with driving way up into the mountains to help out on a farm that provided food for hungry folks in the area. However, when we arrived, we discovered it was less of a farm and more of an overgrown backyard garden, complete with an old farmhouse and rusty tools scattered about the yard. The woman who owned the property, Cherie, she came out of the house when she saw our vans pull up. She greeted us warmly, and then from her rocking chair on the porch proceeded to have us all stand in the sunny yard as she told us about how the farm provided healthy food to so many families who normally would only get canned good donations, and how she opened her farmhouse as a sort of halfway house for folks who needed help after being in drug recovery or transitioning out of homelessness. We then got to work under Cherie's direction, weeding the overgrown garden and planting new rows of peas and squash. Now, planting was a challenge because the ground seemed more rock than soil, and everything grew on a steep angle on the side of that mountain. In addition to the rough and rocky and tilted terrain, the day was incredibly hot and humid, and the only shade to be found on the property was on the porch, which remained fully occupied by Cherie and her current house guest, Marta. It was a long, hard day, and at the end of our time on the farm, I went up to Cherie and asked if there was anything else we could do before we left. "Can you help me put the tools away?" she asked, pushing her creaking body out of the rocking chair. "Sure," I said half-heartedly, looking around. to see that all of the students and other adult leaders had abandoned me and were already settled into the air-conditioned vans. So by myself, I picked up the tools scattered across the yard and began to carry them back towards Cherie, who was making her way slowly down the porch steps. "No," she hollered across the yard. "They go in the shed," she screamed, pointing way up the hill. At that, I looked up to find a structure that had clearly been nailed together by unskilled hands, with scrap wood and bits of tin and aluminum and even some spots covered with cardboard and duct tape. To call it a structure would be generous, much less to call it a shed. And I couldn't imagine that the tools would be better protected there than laid out in the yard. But as per usual for the day, I followed Cherie's directions and made my way up the hill slowly, and Cherie walked along. When we got up there to that pile of mismatched textiles that looked like it would blow over with a light breeze, Cherie stopped and just stared at the structure with a smile. Setting her hand on the side of it, she said quietly, "Whenever I come up here, I see God." "That's lovely," I said, wanting to get the tools put away and get back to the church for a shower before all the hot water was gone. "Don't you get it?" she said, turning towards me, face shifting from a smile to a scowl. She then proceeded to touch the different scraps, telling me the story of each of them, how this scrap of aluminum siding came from Mr. Brown's property after his barn had burnt down, how the roof tiles were left over from when her sister built her house about 30 minutes up the road, how the pieces of scrap wood were recovered by a teenage boy from her church out of a dumpster at an abandoned construction site, how each person had offered these raw materials hoping they might be helpful in some way to Cherie. "So I made a shed," she said proudly. And in an instant, that rickety edifice transformed before me into a cathedral, into a tabernacle of God, where God's grace transformed these scraps and the stories they carried into something far more. All of a sudden, I too could sense God's presence bursting through the cracks and crevices in that pieced together structure. "Isn't it just heavenly?" Cherie sighed. "It is," I responded quietly. "So you get it?" Cherie asked gently. "Yes, ma'am," I said. And as if snapping out of a trance, she removed her hand, shook her head, and barked, "Good, now put away the tools and get out of here." Friends, for so many reasons, these are challenging times for cultivating holy imagination. Because in the midst of mayhem and uncertainty, in the middle of a barrage of news alerts and social media feeds, in the midst of division and disagreement, in the midst of violence and natural disasters, in the midst of the bombardment of the everyday chaos of life, we can too easily lose sense of who we are and who we are called to be. Yet this parable, in all its strangeness, gives us a taste, even a fleeting one, of a world redeemed and made right, a world saturated by God's grace and generosity and love. It pushes the bounds of our communal imagination, inviting us to dream of God's abundance beyond our expectations. And this is my hope for us today, an invitation for us together as people of faith, as those called to proclaim and share and live out the gospel, that even in these overwhelming and challenging times, we might nurture holy imagination for what God can and will do. I pray that we might act in ways that reveal God's grace and love in the face of hate and hurt. I pray that we may tap into God's expansive vision for creation and for us, and even when we struggle to do so. This parable offers assurance that God is not bound by our limited insight or rationality. God doesn't work with just a little better version of our logic. Instead, God's kingdom is marked by grace beyond our imagining and generosity beyond our deserving. Thanks be to God. Amen.